Sandro is the Ice King, but inside he's freezing to death. Believing his manhood, his strength and command died on the operating table, he haunts a 24-hour diner to escape the judgmental eyes of his own men. Nia Carter, working double shifts to support her sister, sees through his terrifying reputation. When she challenges his brooding silence, she pierces the armor of his insecurity. The tension is a slow-burn realization that Sandro isn't just fighting a rival family, he's fighting to remember he is still a man. The rain over Naples didn't wash anything away. It only turned the grit of the city into a slick, suffocating layer of oil and regret. Alessandro Sandro Moretti stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse, staring at the blurred lights of the harbor below. In his hand, a crystal glass of amber liquid remained untouched, the ice long since melted into a tepid pool. He didn't drink anymore. He didn't do much of anything except exist in the hollowed-out remains of a life that used to belong to a king. The reflection in the glass was a cruel reminder of the night Marco Bellini tried to erase him. The scars on Sandro's shoulder and chest were jagged, angry things that pulled at his skin whenever he moved, but the scars the world couldn't see were the ones that truly paralyzed him. He was the Ice King, a title that used to signify a ruthless, unshakable command over the Moretti Empire. Now it felt like a mockery. He felt like a ghost haunting his own hallways, a man who had lost the very essence of his manhood, his strength, his virility, and the fire that had once made his enemies tremble. He could hear the hushed whispers of his men in the corridor outside. They thought he couldn't hear them, or perhaps they didn't care if he did. They spoke of the old Sandro in the past tense, wondering aloud if the hit had taken more than just his health. They whispered about his sudden withdrawal, his lack of appetite for the business, and the rumors Bellini was industriously spreading through the streets, that Sandro was broken in ways a man shouldn't be. Every word was a needle under his fingernails. His pride, the very thing that built his throne, was now the weight dragging him to the bottom of the ocean. He equated his worth entirely with his physical dominance, and without it, he felt like a fraud wearing a dead man's suit. The silence of the penthouse was too loud. It hummed with the expectation of a leader who no longer knew how to lead. Sandro turned away from the window, his movements stiff and cautious, as if his soul might shatter if he moved too quickly. He reached for a cigarette, but stopped, his fingers trembling just enough to be visible. He curled his hand into a fist until his knuckles turned white. He hated this weakness. He hated the way his heartbeat felt erratic, a frantic bird trapped in a ribcage that felt too small. Seeking an escape from the suffocating luxury of his isolation, he signaled for Luca Romano, his most loyal bodyguard. Luca entered with a silent nod, his eyes carefully neutral. He, at least, had the decency not to look at Sandro with pity, though the heavy air of concern followed him like a shadow. Sandro didn't need to speak. He simply grabbed his heavy wool coat, hiding the scars in the hollowed-out frame that used to be a source of terror for others. They descended into the garage in a silence that tasted of copper and ash. As the black sedan cut through the rain-slicked city of Naples, Sandro watched the world go by through tinted glass. He didn't want the high-end clubs or the private lounges where he would have to perform the role of the boss. He needed somewhere where the light was too dim for anyone to see the cracks in his armor. Eventually, the car slowed in front of a 24-hour diner, its neon sign flickering with a dying hum. It was a place of grease, steam, and anonymity, a refuge for the lost and the tired. Sandro stepped out into the cold rain, the droplets stinging his face, a sensation he welcomed because it was at least real. He walked towards the door, his designer shoes clicking on the pavement, a king of ashes entering a kingdom of neon and plastic. He didn't know it yet, but the ice was about to meet the one thing that could actually melt it. The diner was a graveyard for the restless, smelling of burnt chicory and industrial-strength floor cleaner. Alessandro Sandro Moretti sat in the farthest booth, where the shadow of a vending machine cut across the table like a jagged blade. He didn't look like a man who owned half the shipping docks in the Mediterranean. He looked like a statue carved from cold gray stone, trapped in the flickering pink hum of a dying neon sign. He kept his hands beneath the table, hidden in the folds of his dark overcoat, because the sight of his own pale, tremulous fingers made the bile rise in his throat. He was a king of ashes, waiting for the wind to finally blow him away. Nia Carter watched him from behind the laminate counter. She had seen men like him before, men who carried the weight of the world on their shoulders, but there was something different about the one in the back booth. He didn't look tired, he looked extinguished. Every other customer who walked through the door flinched at the sight of him, sensing the predatory aura that even trauma couldn't fully erase. But to Nia, she was just another patron taking up space and nursing a cold cup of coffee that she had to keep refilling. She grabbed the glass pot and marched towards him, her sneakers squeaking on the linoleum. As she approached, the air grew colder, heavy with the scent of expensive cologne and the metallic tang of something dangerous. Sandro didn't look up. He didn't even acknowledge her presence as the shadow of her apron fell across his scarred face. "You're going to turn into a pillar of salt if you keep staring at that wall, honey," Nia said, her voice cutting through his brooding silence like a serrated knife. She tipped the pot, steaming liquid splashing into his mug. A few drops hit the back of his hand, but he didn't move. He didn't even hiss. Sandro finally shifted his gaze, his eyes hollow and dark, looking at her as if she were a ghost haunting his peripheral vision. "You're late with the refill," he rasped, his voice a low, gravelly friction that usually made men's knees shake. Nia didn't blink. She didn't apologize or retreat into the kitchen as his men expected everyone to do. Instead, she set the pot down on the table with a definitive thud and leaned in, forcing him to look at her. "I'm not late. You're just sitting here waiting for the world to end so you don't have to deal with whatever's eating you alive. You look like you need to feel something for once, Moretti, even if it's just the burn of bad coffee." The use of his name made the air in the diner turn electric. He hadn't told her who he was, yet she spoke it with a casual contempt that suggested his reputation meant nothing to her. Sandro felt a strange, uncomfortable heat crawl up his neck. It wasn't the heat of anger, it was the heat of being seen. For months, he had been a project for his doctors and a disappointment for his soldiers, but to this woman, he was just a man failing at the simple task of being human. "You have a lot to say for someone who carries a tray for a living," Sandro said, his pride flaring up like a dying ember. He equated his worth entirely with dominance, and her lack of fear felt like a direct assault on the masculinity he thought he had lost. Nia laughed, a dry, sharp sound that echoed off the empty booths. "And you have a lot of ego for someone who looks like he's one bad day away from a casket. Drink your coffee, Moretti, or don't, but stop looking at the wall like it owes you an apology." She turned on her heel and walked away, her ponytail swinging with a rhythm that was entirely too confident for her surroundings. Sandro watched her go, his fingers slowly curling into a fist. For the first time in a year, the Ice King wasn't thinking about his scars or the rumors of his impotence. He was thinking about the fire in a waitress's eyes and the way his heart was suddenly thumping against his ribs, reminding him, however painfully, that he was still alive. The air in the Moretti estate was thick with the scent of old leather and cold, expensive tobacco, but to Alessandro, it felt like the stagnant breath of a tomb. He sat behind the massive mahogany desk that had belonged to his father and his father before him, yet he felt like an intruder in his own sanctuary. His hand rested near a stack of ledger reports he hadn't the heart to read, his thumb tracing the faint, jagged edge of a scar that peeked from beneath his cuff. The flickering memory of the waitress, of Nia's sharp tongue and her refusal to flinch, was the only thing that felt real in weeks, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of his kingdom. The heavy oak doors groaned open, and Vittorio De Luca stepped inside. As the family's consigliere, Vittorio was usually a man of measured steps and calm reassurances, but today his face was a mask of grim necessity. He didn't wait for an invitation to sit. He leaned over the desk, his shadow falling across Sandro's lap, cutting off the dim light of the afternoon. "The capos are talking, Sandro," Vittorio began, his voice a low, dangerous rasp that vibrated in the quiet room. "And it isn't the kind of talk we can silence with a simple display of payroll. They see you haunting the shadows. They see a man who hasn't stepped into the light of the docks or the boardroom in months. They see the Ice King melting, and they're starting to wonder who will claim the water that's left." Sandro didn't look up. He focused on a small crack in the desktop. "Let them talk, Vittorio. They know what happens to those who speak out of turn." "That worked when they feared you," Vittorio countered, his hand slamming down on the desk with a crack that made Sandro's pulse spike, though he forced his body to remain a statue. Marco Bellini is out there right now, whispering in the ears of our associates. He tells them you are broken, not just in body, but in spirit. He says the hit took your manhood, and that a man who cannot lead himself certainly cannot lead an empire. The word broken hit Sandro like a physical blow, an echoing reminder of his own internal shame. His pride flared, a sudden hot burst of the old Sandro, but it was quickly dampened by the crushing weight of his insecurity. He equated his worth entirely with his physical dominance, and right now he felt like a hollowed-out shell. Bellini is a vulture, Sandra spat, finally meeting Vittorio's gaze. His eyes were dark, burning with a mixture of rage and agonizing vulnerability. Vultures only circle when they smell death, Vittorio said, his tone softening but remaining firm. The family's faith is wavering, Alessandro. If you don't show them the man they once followed, the man who would burn the city down to protect his own, they will find someone else who will. You are at the breaking point. Either you reclaim your throne or you let Bellini bury you in it. Vittorio turned and left without another word, the click of the door sounding like the final turn of a key in a lock. Sandro sat in the ensuing silence, the walls of the room feeling as though they were closing in. The crushing expectations of his legacy and the biting truth of Vittorio's warning made it impossible to stay within those gilded walls. He needed the anonymity of the neon lights. He needed the one place where he wasn't a king failing his people, but a man who was allowed to be a ruin. He rose, his movements stiff and fueled by a desperate, frantic need to escape. He didn't call for Luca. He didn't take the armored sedan. He slipped out through the service entrance, driving himself towards the grimy, flickering sanctuary of the late-night diner. He was a man drowning, and for some reason he couldn't name, Nia Carter was the only person who had ever dared to offer him a hand instead of a prayer. The sky over the city finally broke, unleashing a torrential downpour that turned the world outside the diner into a blurred kaleidoscope of gray and neon. Inside, the hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock were the only sounds until Sandro rose from his booth. He didn't look at Nia as he headed for the door, but he felt her eyes on his back, sharp, observant, and entirely unimpressed by his status. He stepped out into the deluge, the cold rain soaking through his wool coat in seconds, but he barely felt the chill. His mind was a storm of its own, echoing with Vittorio's warnings about the family's wavering faith and Bellini's poisonous rumors. He was fumbling with his keys at the driver's side of his car when a shadow blocked the flickering street lamp. He spun around, hand instinctively reaching for the holster that wasn't there, only to find Nia standing in the rain, clutching a plastic trash bag over her head like a makeshift shield. "You're going to drive into a pole in this weather, Moretti," she shouted over the thunder. "You can barely stand straight, let alone navigate a flooded highway." "I don't remember asking for a navigator," Sandro rasped. But his knees chose that moment to buckle slightly, a reminder of the physical and psychological exhaustion that had been eating him alive since the hit. Nia didn't ask for permission. She grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong and grounding. "Move over. I'm driving you home before you get us both killed." The drive to the penthouse was a blur of swishing wipers and heavy silence. When they finally reached the top floor, the expansive living room felt cold and cavernous, a gilded cage for a man who felt like a ghost. The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, making the city lights below look like drowning embers. Sandro stood in the center of the room, water dripping from his hair onto the Italian marble, his frame trembling with a chill that came from deep within his bones. Nia moved with a quiet, efficient grace, shedding her wet uniform jacket. She turned to find him staring at his own reflection in the dark glass, his eyes hollow with the internalized shame that had become his constant companion. He looked like a man waiting for a blow he couldn't see coming. "Take off the coat, Sandro," she said softly, her voice no longer biting, but filled with a rare, grounding warmth. When he didn't move, she stepped closer, her hands reaching for the buttons of his sodden overcoat. Sandro stiffened, his pride flaring even as his resolve crumbled. He equated his worth entirely with the physical dominance he thought he had lost, and having a waitress undress him felt like the final admission of his defeat. "I'm not a child," he growled, though the sound lacked its usual venom. "No," Nia whispered, peeling the heavy wool from his shoulders. You're a man who's forgotten he's allowed to be human." As the layers fell away, the jagged scars across his chest were revealed in the dim light. Sandro closed his eyes, bracing for the look of pity or disgust he was sure would follow. Instead, he felt the heat of her fingertips tracing the edge of the puckered skin. It wasn't a clinical touch or a fearful one. It was an acknowledgement. The physical barrier he had built around his heart, the belief that his manhood had died on that operating table, began to fracture under the weight of her presence. When she leaned in, her forehead resting against his as it did in the shadows of the diner, the Ice King finally began to melt. In the silence of the penthouse, with only the rhythm of the rain against the glass, Sandro realized that his strength wasn't in the absence of his scars, but in the courage to let someone see them. For the first time since the night of the attack, the air didn't feel like ash in his lungs. He was breathing again, fueled by the unexpected passion of a woman who saw the king beneath the ruins. The following morning, the atmosphere within the Moretti penthouse had shifted from the stagnant chill of a crypt to the vibrating tension of a war room in mid-prep. Alessandro stood by the window, but he was no longer staring through the glass at a city that felt out of reach. He was watching the movement of the clouds, his posture straight, his shoulders squared in a way that hadn't been seen since before the Bellini hit. There was a renewed clarity in his gaze, a spark that suggested the Ice King had finally stopped mourning his own ghost. He wore a fresh suit, the fabric straining slightly against his chest, but he no longer felt like he was wearing a disguise. Luca Romano stood at the edge of the living room, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, his eyes moving with practiced precision between the boss and the hallway where Nia Carter had just disappeared to change. As Sandro's primary bodyguard, Luca was trained to read the subtle shifts in a man's pulse, the tightening of a jaw, and the rhythm of a breath. He saw the change in Sandro, the reclamation of a masculinity that had been buried under layers of internalized shame and psychological scars. It was as if the night with the waitress had acted as a grounding wire, pulling the lightning out of Sandro's clouded mind and channeling it back into his spirit. "The car is ready, boss," Luca said, his voice a steady anchor in the quiet room. "Vittorio is waiting at the docks. He said the men need to see you." Sandro turned, and for the first time in months, Luca felt the familiar, predatory weight of the Moretti authority. "Let them wait a few minutes longer," Sandro rasped, his voice regaining its sandpaper edge. "I want to ensure Nia gets home safely first." Luca felt a cold knot of apprehension tighten in his gut. While he was relieved to see the boss returning to form, he knew the underworld had no room for soft spots. Nia was no longer just a waitress who had sparked Sandro's curiosity. She had become the catalyst for his transformation, and in their world, that made her a target. Marco Bellini was a vulture who specialized in finding a man's Achilles heel, and Nia was now a glowing beacon in the dark. "With all due respect, sir," Luca began, choosing his words with the care of a man walking through a minefield. "She's a civilian. The more time she spends in this penthouse, the more her scent lingers on your clothes, the more dangerous her walk home becomes. Bellini's people are everywhere. They are looking for any sign of a crack in your armor, and they will see her as exactly that." Sandro's eyes darkened, the warmth from the previous night flickering into a cold, protective fire. "She isn't a crack. She's the reason I'm standing up straight." "I understand that, boss," Luca replied, his gaze unwavering. "But to Bellini, she isn't a person. She is leverage. She is collateral damage waiting to happen. If you want to keep her, you have to be prepared for the fact that loving her might be the most dangerous thing you've ever done." Sandro walked towards the door, his movements fluid and calculated, a king reclaiming his domain. He didn't answer Luca immediately, but as he passed, he placed a heavy hand on the bodyguard's shoulder. The grip was firm, a silent acknowledgement of the truth in Luca's warning. He knew the risks, but the flaw of his pride was being replaced by a fierce new brand of loyalty, one that didn't just demand power, but gave him something worth using it for. As Nia stepped back into the room, her eyes meeting Sandro's with that same no-nonsense defiance, Luca felt a wave of dread wash over him. He saw the way Sandro looked at her, not as a conquest, but as a lifeline. It was a beautiful human sight, but in the shadow of the Moretti legacy, it was a death sentence waiting to be signed.
He would protect her with his life, but he would not be enough.
They didn't look like the street thugs she was used to avoiding. They wore tailored leather jackets and moved with the cold, coordinated precision of professional soldiers. "Nia Carter," one of them said, his voice a flat, emotionless drone. "Mr. Bellini wants to have a word about your friend, Moretti." Nia didn't scream. She knew screaming in this part of the city only brought more trouble. Instead, she tightened her grip on her keys, her knuckles white. "I don't know any Moretti. You've got the wrong girl." The man smiled, a jagged, mirthless expression that didn't reach his eyes. "The Ice King hasn't been this distracted in years. We know exactly who you are. You're the girl who gave him his pulse back." Nia moved to bolt, diving toward the gap between a dumpster and the brick wall, but they were too fast. A heavy hand clamped around her arm, spinning her back with enough force to make the world tilt. She lashed out, her keys grazing the cheek of the second man, but a sharp, stinging blow to her stomach stole the air from her lungs. She buckled, the rough pavement scraping her knees as she was dragged toward the side door of the van. "Easy now," the first man hissed, pressing a cloth soaked in something chemically sweet against her face. "You're the leverage we've been waiting for. Sandro's been playing it safe far too long. He needs a reason to come out and play." Nia fought the darkness pulling at the edges of her vision, her mind flashing to the image of Sandro in the pink neon of the diner. She realized then that Luca had been right. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was the missing piece of a war she didn't understand. As the van doors slammed shut, plunging her into a terrifying, lightless silence, she realized that the Ice King was about to be pushed to his breaking point. If Sandro couldn't reclaim his confidence now, he wouldn't just lose his empire, he would lose the only person who had ever made him feel like a man again. The news of the abduction hit Sandro like a physical detonation, stripping away the last vestiges of his hesitation and replacing them with a cold, terrifying focus. He stood in the center of the penthouse, the air around him vibrating with a lethal energy that made even the seasoned soldiers in the room take an instinctive step back. Vittorio De Luca was mid-sentence, outlining a safe protocol that involved back-channel negotiations and a week-long surveillance of the Bellini warehouses. But Sandro wasn't listening. He was no longer the man who hid behind silk shirts and internalized shame. He was a king reclaiming his domain, and his pride had been replaced by something far more dangerous, a fierce, singular loyalty to the woman who had brought him back to life. "Enough," Sandro rasped, the sandpaper edge of his voice cutting through Vittorio's logic like a blade. "We aren't waiting for a meeting that won't happen. We aren't negotiating for a life Bellini has already put a price on. If he wanted to talk, he wouldn't have touched her. He wants a war, and I'm going to give him one that burns his legacy to the ground." Vittorio stepped forward, his face a mask of concern. "Alessandro, the board will see this as a reckless emotional response. It's exactly what Bellini wants, to draw you out into an uncalculated slaughter. Stay behind the walls, let Luca and the specialized teams handle the extraction." Sandro turned to the consigliere, his eyes dark and burning with an intensity that signaled the end of the Ice King's winter. "The board follows the man who wins, and I am going to win. I spent months believing I was less of a man because of my scars. I was wrong. My manhood isn't in my physical perfection. It's in my capacity to protect what is mine." He looked over at Luca Romano, who was already checking the magazine of his sidearm, a grim, knowing look on his face. "Get the cars. All of them. We're going to the old shipyard at the south end. That's where Bellini keeps his prizes." The mission was anything but safe. Sandro ignored every tactical manual, refusing to stay in the armored lead vehicle. He sat in the passenger seat of the first SUV, his hands steady on a modified submachine gun, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. They tore through the city like a black tidal wave, ignoring traffic lights and the prying eyes of the night shift police who knew better than to interfere with a Moretti motorcade in full fury. When they arrived at the shipyard, Sandro didn't wait for the breach teams to set their charges. He stepped out of the vehicle before it had even fully stopped, his boots hitting the gravel with the weight of a death sentence. The warehouse was a cavernous, rotting structure, guarded by Bellini's men who were clearly expecting a siege, not a frontal assault led by the boss himself. The air was suddenly filled with the roar of gunfire and the smell of ozone and sulfur. Sandro moved with a calculated, predatory fluidity that defied his recent physical struggles. He wasn't hiding. He was a silhouette of vengeance moving through the muzzle flashes. He pushed through the main doors, clearing the path with a brutal efficiency that left Bellini's soldiers stunned. Every shot he fired was an answer to the rumors of his weakness, a violent reclamation of the power he had nearly let slip away. He found her in a back office, tied to a chair under a single flickering bulb. When Nia looked up, her face bruised, but her eyes still flashing with that same no-nonsense defiance, the last of Sandro's psychological barriers crumbled. He didn't care about the territory, or the mutiny, or the politics of the council. He crossed the room in 3 strides, his hands, the hands he had once thought were too tremulous to lead, cutting her ties with a steady, unbreakable grip. He pulled her against him, the heat of her body a reminder that he was no longer a ghost. He had saved her, and in doing so, he had finally saved himself. The shipyard smelled of salt, spent gunpowder, and the dying echoes of Marco Bellini's ambition. Sandro Moretti stood amidst the wreckage of the warehouse, his arm anchored firmly around Nia Carter, whose presence was the only thing keeping the world from dissolving back into gray ash. Across the oil-slicked floor, Marco Bellini lay groveling, his silk tie shredded and his casual arrogance replaced by the high-pitched whimpering of a man who realized he had miscalculated the depth of a king's resolve.
Perceived impotence had backfired, instead acting as the catalyst for a more calculated and lethal reclamation of power. You thought you could take everything because I was bleeding, Marco, Sandro rasped, his voice no longer a ghost, but a low, terrifying rumble that carried the full weight of the Moretti legacy. He looked down at the rival who had mocked his manhood in public meetings, and for the first time, Sandro felt no shame regarding his scars. He realized that his strength wasn't tied to the physical perfection he had lost, but to the vulnerability he had found in loving someone worth protecting. He wasn't the Ice King anymore. He was something far more dangerous because he was finally whole. With a sharp nod to Luca Romano, Sandro signaled the end of the Bellini era. He didn't need to watch the final outcome. He turned his back on the carnage, walking Nia out into the cool morning air where the black Moretti motorcade waited like a line of silent sentinels. The soldiers who had once whispered about his weakness now stood at rigid attention, their eyes wide with a new kind of fear and a newfound respect. They saw the man who had ignored safe protocols and charged into a shipyard to save his own, and they knew the mutiny Bellini had hoped for was dead. Weeks later, the Moretti estate was no longer a tomb of stagnant breath and old leather. The heavy oak doors to the boardroom swung open, and for the first time in the family's history, Sandro didn't walk in alone. Beside him was Nia, wearing a dress of deep emerald that matched the fierce defiance still burning in her eyes. She didn't look like a waitress who had been caught in a crossfire. She looked like the foundation of a new empire. Sandro took his seat at the head of the table, but he didn't pull his chair in until Nia was seated directly at his right hand, in the spot traditionally reserved for the most trusted advisor. Vittorio De Luca watched from across the table, his grim mask softening into a look of cautious approval. He saw that Sandro had stopped trying to be the old version of himself. The boss had accepted his scars, no longer hiding them behind a shroud of pride, but wearing them as the price of his new strength. The family has lived too long on fear alone, Sandro announced to the assembled capos, his hand reaching out across the mahogany to cover Nia's. His grip was steady, an unbreakable anchor. From today, we lead with a different kind of loyalty. Nia isn't just a guest in this house. She is my partner. She is the reason the Moretti name still means something in this city, and she will be treated as the queen of this organization. A few of the older men shifted, perhaps uncomfortable with the sudden shift in tradition, but one look at Sandro's darkened, predatory gaze silenced any protest before it could begin. He had reclaimed his confidence not through brutality alone, but through the realization that his manhood was defined by the heart he had guarded so fiercely. As the meeting commenced, Nia squeezed his hand back, her no-nonsense spirit providing the human friction that kept him grounded. In the shared future they were building, Sandro found a strength that was no longer brittle or cold. He was no longer a king of ashes. He was a man who walked through fire and found his throne on the other side.